When a woman legally bought like cattle makes a choice that will shatter a town's silence, the only man who can stand with her is one who already died inside years ago. Death came to the frontier in the form of burning wagons and screaming horses. Among the ashes and blood, a single woman breathed, broken, terrified, watching the horizon like prey awaiting its predator. The man who found her had buried his own life long ago. He knew the look in her eyes because he wore it himself. What he didn't know was that saving her would mean choosing to live again, or die trying. Stay until the end to see if love can survive ownership, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The smoke rose black against the Colorado sky, a funeral pyre visible for miles across the empty plains. Ethan Hale saw it from the ridge where he'd been checking fence lines, and his first instinct was to turn away. Other people's disasters weren't his concern anymore. He'd learned that lesson in blood and ash 3 years back, when his own cabin had burned with everyone he loved still inside. But his horse, a gray mare with more sense than her rider, kept walking toward it. Maybe she smelled water from the creek that ran near the road. Maybe she was just tired of following a dead man's commands. Either way, Ethan found himself riding down into the valley where the smoke was thickest, where the vultures were already beginning to circle. 3 wagons, burned down to their wheel rims and scattered cargo. Bodies sprawled in positions that told the story. They'd tried to run, tried to fight, tried to protect each other. All the usual futile gestures people made when death came calling with guns and torches. Ethan had seen massacres before. Comanche raids, bandit attacks, settlers who picked the wrong trail at the wrong time. This one looked recent, maybe 6, 7 hours old. The ashes were still warm and the blood hadn't fully dried in the dirt. He should have kept riding, should have reported it to the marshal in Silver Creek, 20 miles south, and let someone else deal with the burial detail. But as he circled the wreckage, checking for anything salvageable or anyone who might need a quick mercy bullet, he heard it. A breath. Shallow, ragged, coming from beneath an overturned trunk near the 3rd wagon. Ethan dismounted slowly, his hand moving to the colt at his hip more from habit than expectation. Raiders didn't usually leave witnesses. If someone was alive under there, they were probably dying, and dying slow. He kicked the trunk aside. A woman lay curled in the dirt, her dress torn and stained with blood and soot. Dark hair matted across her face, hands clutched against her chest like she was still trying to protect something that was already gone. She wasn't moving, but her chest rose and fell in stuttering intervals. Not dead yet. Close, though. Ethan knelt beside her, checking for wounds. A gash across her temple, already clotting, bruises on her arms and throat. But no bullet holes, no stab wounds. She'd survived by hiding while everyone else burned. Smart. Or lucky. On the frontier, there wasn't much difference. "Can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. He didn't talk much anymore. Hadn't had reason to. The woman's eyes opened, wide, dark, filled with a terror so raw it was almost animal. She tried to scramble back, but her body wouldn't cooperate. A sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half scream, cut short by pain. "Easy." Ethan raised his hands, showing empty palms. "Raiders are gone. You're safe." She stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Her gaze darted past him to the burned wagons, to the bodies visible in the wreckage, and something broke behind her eyes. She started shaking, tremors running through her whole frame. Shock. He'd seen it before. The mind's way of protecting itself when reality became too much to process. "I'm going to pick you up," Ethan said quietly. "Get you out of here, understand?" No response. Just that 1,000-yard stare and the shaking that wouldn't stop. He slid his arms beneath her carefully, expecting resistance. She was light, too light, like she hadn't been eating regular even before the attack. When he lifted her, she didn't fight, didn't make a sound. Just curled against his chest with her eyes squeezed shut, like if she couldn't see the world, it couldn't hurt her anymore. Ethan carried her to his horse and settled her in the saddle, then swung up behind her. She swayed, boneless, and he had to wrap an arm around her waist to keep her upright. She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. "Where?" The word came out broken, barely audible. "Where are you taking me?" "My place. Closest shelter." He turned the mare north, away from the massacre, toward the mountains where his cabin sat alone in a valley that rarely saw visitors. No. Her voice cracked. Town. Take me to town. Town's 20 miles south, and you won't make it that far without treatment. My cabin's 3 miles. You'll live that long. She tried to twist around to look at him, but the movement made her gasp in pain. I can't. You can shut up and stay alive, or you can argue and bleed out on my horse. Your choice. The harshness in his tone seemed to cut through her panic. She went rigid, then slowly nodded. Ethan felt her weight settle against him as consciousness started slipping away again. The ride took an hour through terrain that would have been faster without extra weight, but the mare was steady and the woman stayed quiet. Twice she stirred, mumbling words he couldn't make out, names maybe, or prayers. He didn't ask. Didn't matter. The dead stayed dead no matter what you called them. His cabin appeared as the sun dropped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley. It wasn't much. 4 rooms built from rough timber, a stone chimney, a small barn for the mare, and a milk cow he rarely bothered with anymore. The garden had gone to weeds. The fence needed mending. The whole place had the feel of something slowly returning to wilderness, reclaimed by a land that didn't care if men lived or died on it. Ethan carried the woman inside and laid her on the bed in what used to be the guest room. Used to be his daughter's room, back when he had a daughter. He'd stripped it bare after the fire, unable to look at her things anymore, and now it held only a bed frame and a trunk full of old blankets. He lit the lamp and got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Pale skin that suggested she hadn't spent much time in the sun. Features that were probably refined before fear and exhaustion carved them hollow. Not a frontier woman. Not born to this life. "What's your name?" he asked, pulling out his medical kit, a battered tin box with whatever supplies he'd managed to keep stocked. Her eyes opened, unfocused. "Lila." "Lila what?" A pause. Too long. Just, "Lila." Lying. He'd expected that. People who survived massacres usually had reasons to hide their names. He didn't push it. He had his own ghosts he didn't talk about. He cleaned the wound on her temple with whiskey. She hissed but didn't cry out, and wrapped it with clean linen. Checked her pupils for concussion signs. Felt along her ribs for breaks. She watched him the whole time with those dark, wary eyes, tracking his every movement like she expected him to transform into something dangerous. "You're lucky," he said, stepping back. "Nothing broken. Cuts and bruises will heal. You'll be sore for a week, but you'll live." Lucky. She repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Everyone else is dead, and I'm lucky." "You're breathing. They're not. That's the only kind of luck that matters out here." She turned her face away, toward the wall. Her shoulders started shaking again, silent sobs that she tried to muffle in the pillow. Ethan left her alone. Grief was private. He'd learned that the hard way. He went to the main room and built up the fire, then put coffee on to boil. Outside, the mare needed tending, and there was water to draw from the well. Normal tasks. The kind that kept a man moving forward when thinking too much led to dangerous places. By the time he came back inside, night had fallen completely, and the cabin was warm from the fire. He checked on her again. She'd fallen into a fitful sleep, still curled tight like she was trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Ethan settled into the chair by the fireplace with his coffee and his rifle across his knees. Old habits. He'd learned to sleep light after the fire, if he slept at all. Most nights he just sat and watched the flames until dawn. Tonight was no different, except for the woman breathing in the next room. A stranger in his house. A complication he hadn't asked for. He should take her to town in the morning. Hand her over to the marshal. Let someone else figure out what to do with her. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But he'd seen the terror in her eyes when she woke. Seen the way she'd asked for town and then immediately looked like she regretted it. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't just the men who'd burned those wagons, and damn him for a fool, but he recognized that look. Had worn it himself for 3 years now, ever since the night he'd come home to find his life turned to ash. The dead man in him said to let her go, cut ties before they formed, stay alone where it was safe. But some stubborn part of him that hadn't quite finished dying yet said to wait, to watch, to see what the morning brought. Outside, coyotes howled in the darkness. Inside, the fire burned low, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. And in the room that used to belong to his daughter, a woman who called herself Lila slept the broken sleep of the haunted, while a man who'd stopped living years ago kept watch over her like he still remembered how to care if someone lived or died. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night, that simple choice to wait until morning would change everything. Yeah. 3 days passed before she spoke more than a few words. Ethan kept his distance, checking on her only to bring food and water to change the bandage on her head. She ate mechanically, staring at nothing, and slept in fits and starts. Every sound from outside made her tense. Every time he entered the room, she watched him like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. He understood. Trust took time, and she had no reason to trust anyone right now. On the fourth morning, he found her out of bed, standing at the window looking toward the mountains. She'd wrapped herself in one of the old blankets, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. In the early light, she looked less like a survivor and more like a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead yet. "You should be resting," Ethan said from the doorway. She didn't turn. "How long are you planning to keep me here?" "I'm not keeping you anywhere. You're free to leave whenever you want." "To go where?" Her voice was flat, empty. "Back to that road? Back to town where I know no one and have nothing?" "That's your choice to make." She finally turned to face him. The fear in her eyes had cooled to something harder, calculation. "Why did you help me?" "Found you dying. Seemed wasteful to let you finish the job." "That's not a reason." "It's the only one I've got." She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed, measured against some internal standard he couldn't see. "You live alone out here?" "Yes." "How long?" 3 years. "That's a long time to be alone." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I like it that way." "Then why am I still here?" Good question. He'd been asking himself the same thing every morning when he woke to the sound of someone else breathing in his house. "You needed time to heal." "I'm healed enough to ride." "Then ride." He turned to leave, done with the conversation, but her voice stopped him. "I don't know how." He looked back. "How to what?" "To ride. A horse." "I've never learned." The admission seemed to cost her something. Pride, maybe. Or the last shred of the person she used to be. Ethan almost laughed. A woman on the frontier who couldn't ride was like a fish that couldn't swim, doomed from the start. But the sound died in his throat when he saw her expression. She wasn't asking for pity. She was stating a fact, cold and hard as stone. "Then you'll learn," he said. "Can't survive out here without it." Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or just the faint ember of a will to survive that hadn't quite gone out. "You'd teach me?" "If you're staying, you'll need to pull your weight. I'm not running a charity." "I can work. I'm not useless." "Didn't say you were, but this isn't the city. Out here, everyone does everything, or everyone dies, understood?" She nodded slowly. "Understood." "Then get dressed. Lesson starts in an hour." He left before she could respond, heading outside to saddle the mare. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter. In a few weeks, snow would close the passes, and the valley would be cut off from the outside world until spring. If she was staying, he needed to lay down rules, boundaries. Make sure they both understood this was temporary, just until she figured out where to go next, what to do with a life that had been torn apart and scattered like ash on the wind. But as he tightened the cinch on the saddle and the mare snorted warm breath into the cold air, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying to himself, that he'd already made a choice without admitting it, that the dead man he'd been for 3 years was starting to remember what it felt like to have something to protect besides his own solitude. And that terrified him more than any raid, any massacre, any threat the frontier could throw at him. Teaching her to ride was an exercise in patience he didn't know he still possessed. Lila approached the mare like it was a wolf that might turn on her at any moment. Every movement was hesitant, every touch tentative. The horse, bless her steady temperament, stood like a statue while this nervous woman circled her, trying to work up the courage to put her foot in the stirrup. "She won't bite," Ethan said, leaning against the fence. "She's old and lazy and has seen everything worth being scared of. You're not even on the list." "I'm not scared of the horse." "Could have fooled me." Lila shot him a sharp look, the first real spark of defiance he'd seen from her. "I'm scared of falling. There's a difference." Everyone falls, that's how you learn not to. That's a terrible teaching philosophy. It's the only one that works out here. He pushed off the fence and walked over, keeping his movement slow and obvious. Left foot in the stirrup. Grab the horn. Swing your right leg over. Simple. Easy for you to say. She gestured vaguely at him. Taller, stronger. You probably learned to ride before you could walk. Actually, I was 7, broke my arm the first week. He showed her the scar on his forearm, a white line that had healed crooked. Still learned. She looked at the scar, then at the mare, then back at him. Something in her expression shifted, resolved, maybe, or just tired of being afraid. She grabbed the stirrup, pulled herself up with more determination than grace, and swung her leg over, and promptly slid right off the other side. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground, his hands closing around her waist. She gasped, rigid in his grip, and for a second they stood frozen, her suspended halfway between horse and earth, him holding her like she weighed nothing at all. Told you everyone falls, he said quietly. She found her feet stumbling back from him the moment he released her. Her face had gone pale, her breathing quick and shallow. Not from the fall, from the contact. He'd seen that reaction before, knew what it meant. Again, he said, stepping back to give her space. And this time, don't let go of the horn. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Again, you want to learn or not? Her hands curled into fists. For a moment he thought she might refuse, might storm back into the cabin and lock the door behind her. But then she walked back to the mare, grabbed the horn with white-knuckled determination, and hauled herself up. This time she stayed on. Good. Now, don't say anything. The words came out through gritted teeth. She was gripping the horn so hard her hands were shaking, her whole body tense as wire. Just let me sit here for a minute. So he did. Let her sit there on his old mare in the morning sun, learning what it felt like to be higher than the ground, to have something powerful beneath her that she controlled, or at least that wouldn't throw her off without good reason. After a few minutes, her breathing slowed. Her grip on the horn loosened slightly. Okay, she said. What now? He taught her the basics. How to hold the reins, how to squeeze with her legs to go forward, pull back gently to stop, how to shift her weight with the horse's movements instead of fighting them. She was a quick study once the fear backed off, catching on faster than he'd expected. By noon, she was walking the mare in circles around the corral, still tense, but no longer terrified. By mid-afternoon, she'd managed a slow trot without falling off. Enough for today, Ethan called out. You'll be sore tomorrow. She brought the mare to a stop, a little rough, but not bad for a first lesson, and dismounted. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground. He moved to steady her, but she waved him off. I'm fine. You're exhausted. There's a difference. That almost got a smile out of her. Almost. Is that your answer to everything? There's a difference? It is when people confuse things that shouldn't be confused. She led the mare to the fence, moving carefully like every muscle ached. Probably did. Riding used parts of the body most people didn't know they had until the next morning. Thank you, she said, not looking at him, for teaching me. You did the work. I just pointed. Still, you didn't have to. He shrugged. Can't have you stuck here unable to leave. Bad for both of us. This time she did smile, just a flicker at the corner of her mouth. Worried I'll become a permanent fixture? Worried you'll eat me out of supplies before winter. The smile faded. I should start earning my keep then. What needs doing? Ethan looked around the ranch, at the weedy garden, the fence with its broken rails, the cabin that needed chinking before the cold set in. 3 years of neglect stared back at him, all the tasks he'd stopped caring about when caring became too heavy to carry. Everything, he said finally. Pick something and start. I'll handle the rest. She nodded, then turned toward the cabin, paused at the door. Ethan? It was the first time she'd used his name. He waited. Why did your wife leave? The question hit like a fist to the gut. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the sudden roaring in his ears. When he spoke, his voice came out flat and dead. She didn't leave. She died. Her and my daughter both. 3 years ago. Fire. Lila's face went white. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Forget it. He walked past her toward the barn, needing distance, needing to put space between himself and the sympathy he saw rising in her eyes. He didn't want sympathy, didn't deserve it, hadn't earned the right to be pitied for a disaster he'd caused through his own carelessness. Behind him, he heard the cabin door close, heard her footsteps inside, quiet and careful. He stood in the barn, breathing in the smell of hay and leather and horse, waiting for the ghosts to settle back into their usual places. They never left. He'd learned that much. They just retreated to the shadows, waiting for moments like this to remind him that the past never stayed buried, no matter how deep you dug. After a while, he went back to work, fed the animals, checked the water trough, mended a broken hinge on the barn door. Small tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. When dusk fell and he finally went inside, he found Lila in the kitchen. She'd somehow coaxed the old stove into cooperating and was stirring something in a pot that smelled like actual food instead of the half-burned slop he usually settled for. "I found some dried beans and salt pork," she said without looking at him. "It's not much, but it's edible. More than I usually manage." She ladled out 2 bowls and set them on the table. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin and the crackle of the fire. Halfway through the meal, she spoke again. "I had a family too, before." Ethan looked up. She was staring at her bowl, not eating, just holding the spoon like she'd forgotten what it was for. "A husband, a house in Philadelphia, everything proper and respectable and suffocating." Her voice was distant, remembering. "He was a banker, made good money, kept me in dresses and jewelry and dinners with people who smiled to my face and counted my mistakes behind my back. What happened?" "He died. Heart failure," the doctor said. "Quick and clean and inconvenient." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turned out his good money was mostly borrowed money. When he died, his debts came due. Everything went to creditors. The house, the furniture, my jewelry, all of it. "And you?" "I became a problem. A widow with no money, no prospects, and a family back east that had already written me off for marrying beneath them." She finally looked at him, her eyes hard as flint. "So they sold me, drew up a contract, found a buyer, and shipped me west like I was cargo." The words hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. "The man who bought you," Ethan said slowly. "He was in those wagons?" "No, I was being delivered to him. The wagons were just transport. Hired men who didn't ask questions and didn't care what they were carrying as long as they got paid." She set her spoon down with a click. "When the raiders came, I thought it was the end. Thought I'd die there in the dirt with strangers. But then they just left. Took what they wanted and rode off. Left me alive." "So you're running." "I'm surviving. There's a difference." She threw his own words back at him with a bitter smile. "The man who bought me, Victor Crowley, he's not the type to accept a lost shipment. He paid for property, and he'll want his money's worth." "You're not property." "According to the law, I am. Contract's legal. Binding. My family signed it, I signed it, Crowley paid for it. Unless I can buy back my freedom or find some other way out, I belong to him." Ethan pushed his bowl away, appetite gone. "How much?" "How much what?" "How much to buy back your freedom?" She laughed again, sharper this time. "More than you have. More than I could earn in 10 lifetimes out here. Crowley's rich, Ethan. Railroad money. Mining interests. The kind of rich where people don't say no to him because they can't afford to." "Then you can't go back." "I know. And you can't run forever." "I know that too." She met his eyes across the table. "But I can run for now. And when he finds me, because he will find me eventually, I'll figure out what to do then. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Survive until we can't anymore?" He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her there had to be another way, some legal loophole, some escape route she hadn't seen. But he'd lived on the frontier long enough to know that the law was whatever the richest man in the room said it was, and justice was a luxury most people couldn't afford. "You can stay here," he heard himself say. "Long as you need. He won't find you out here." "You don't know that. I know this valley, know the mountains, know how to disappear when I need to." He stood, gathering the bowls. "You want to run? You'll need supplies and skills you don't have yet. So stay. Learn, get strong, then decide where you're going. She stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he meant it or if this was some kind of trap. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Don't need to know you to see you're running from something worse than death. I've been there. Wouldn't wish it on anyone. For a long moment, she said nothing, just sat there in this firelight, this broken woman with a false name and a past that chased her like wolves. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, I'll stay, for now. For now, he agreed. And that's how it started. Two people who'd lost everything, sheltering under the same roof in a valley that winter was already starting to claim. Neither one trusting, neither one whole. Both just trying to survive one more day in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of snow from the high peaks. Inside, the fire burned low, and two ghosts who were still breathing made their fragile, temporary peace with each other. It wouldn't last. Peace never did on the frontier. But for that night, in that moment, it was enough. The days fell into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged, but both relied on. Ethan woke before dawn, built up the fire, and went out to tend the animals. By the time he came back, Lila would be in the kitchen, coaxing breakfast out of their dwindling supplies with an efficiency that surprised him. They ate together in silence, then split up for the day's work. He taught her everything she'd need to survive alone. How to shoot. She had a steady hand once she stopped flinching at the noise. How to trap small game and skin it without wasting meat. How to read weather in the clouds and find water in dry country. How to start a fire with damp wood and keep it going through the night. She learned fast, absorbing lessons like her life depended on it, because it did. In return, she brought order to the chaos he'd been living in, mended his clothes, organized the cabin, cleared the garden, and started planning what to plant come spring, assuming she was still here come spring, though neither of them mentioned that possibility out loud. They talked more as the weeks passed. Small things at first, observations about the weather, questions about how to do some task or fix some tool. Then deeper things, late at night when the darkness made it easier to speak truths that would be too heavy in daylight. She told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a house where appearances mattered more than happiness, about a mother who measured success in dinner invitations, and a father who only noticed her when she disappointed him, about a husband who'd been kind enough until the wedding was over, then gradually revealed himself to be just as controlling as her father, just wrapped in softer words. He told her about the ranch, about building it from nothing with his wife Sarah, about their daughter Emma, who'd been 6 years old and obsessed with catching frogs in the creek, about the night he'd ridden to town for supplies and come back to find the cabin burning, too late to save anything but his own cursed life. "It was my fault," he said one night, staring into his coffee like it held answers. "The fire. I left the stove burning when I shouldn't have. Sarah always told me to bank it before leaving, but I was in a hurry and I thought it would be fine. It wasn't fine. You couldn't have known." "I should have. That's the same thing." Lila was quiet for a moment, then, "My husband's death was my fault too." Ethan looked up sharply. "You said it was heart failure." "It was. Brought on by stress, by debt, by pressure." She set her own cup down with careful precision. "The creditors started circling months before he died. I saw it happening, saw him getting desperate, making worse and worse decisions to try to save us. And I didn't say anything, didn't push him to stop, to walk away, to admit defeat before it killed him. I just let it happen. That's not the same as causing it, isn't it? I could have stopped him, could have forced the issue. But I was comfortable, Ethan. I liked my house and my dresses and pretending everything was fine. So I stayed quiet, and he died, and everything fell apart anyway. If I'd been braver, then maybe you'd both be dead instead of just him. Or maybe nothing would have changed except you'd feel even worse about it." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "The past is the past. Tearing yourself apart over what you should have done doesn't change what happened. You don't believe that. If you did, you wouldn't be out here alone, punishing yourself for a mistake you made 3 years ago." Direct hit. He felt it land like a blade between the ribs. "That's different," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "How?" "Because I was responsible. I was the man of the house. Their safety was my job, and I failed. And I was his wife. Supporting him was my job, and I failed." She met his eyes across the table. "We can trade guilt all night, Ethan, but it won't bring them back. won't fix anything. All it does is keep us stuck in a past we can't change, afraid to build anything new because we think we don't deserve it. Maybe we don't. Or maybe we do, and we're just too scared to try. The truth of that sat between them like a third presence in the room. Neither one could deny it, but neither one could accept it either. So they let it lie there, acknowledged but unresolved, like everything else they were slowly learning to live with. As November turned toward December and the first real snow began to fall, closing the valley off from the outside world, Ethan realized something that should have terrified him, but somehow didn't. He'd stopped counting the days until she left. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he'd started thinking of this as permanent, started planning for 2 instead of 1, started caring whether she was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, started caring, period. And that was dangerous. Caring meant having something to lose again, meant opening himself up to the kind of pain he'd sworn he'd never feel again. But when he watched her standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks with something like peace in her eyes instead of fear, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Not yet, anyway. The reckoning would come eventually. Victor Crowley was out there somewhere, looking for his lost property. And when he found her, because men like that always found what they were looking for, Ethan would have to choose, walk away and let the world take her, like it had taken everything else, or stand and fight for something he had no legal right to protect, no logical reason to risk his life for. The choice should have been easy. The smart move, the safe move, was to step back, to remember that she wasn't his responsibility, wasn't his to save, wasn't anything to him except a temporary complication in a life he'd already ruined once. But late at night, when he lay awake listening to her breathing in the next room, steady now, no longer the ragged gasps of terror that had marked her first weeks here, he knew what choice he'd make when the time came. The same one he should have made 3 years ago, when he chose supplies over safety. This time, he'd choose to stay, to fight, to protect what mattered, even if it cost him everything, because a dead man had nothing left to lose. And maybe, just maybe, fighting for someone else was the only way to finally forgive himself for failing the ones he'd lost. Winter came hard that year, locking the valley in white silence that seemed to muffle even memory. The snow piled higher each week until the cabin became an island in a frozen sea, cut off from everything except the mountains and the sky. Most years, Ethan would have welcomed the isolation. This year, it felt different. This year, he wasn't alone. Lila had settled into the rhythms of frontier life with a determination that bordered on fierce. She chopped wood now without being asked, her strokes more confident than they'd been a month ago. She could load and fire the rifle in under 10 seconds, hit a target at 50 yards more often than not. She'd learned to read the animal's behavior for signs of predators or weather changes, to preserve meat with salt and smoke, to darn socks so well you couldn't see where the holes had been. She was becoming someone new, or maybe just becoming herself for the first time, without the weight of other people's expectations crushing her into shapes she'd never chosen. But the fear never fully left her eyes. Ethan noticed it in small moments, the way she tensed whenever he came back from checking the traps, like she expected him to be someone else, the way she positioned herself near exits, always aware of where the doors and windows were, the way she woke at night from dreams she wouldn't talk about, breathing hard in the darkness until she remembered where she was. She was healing, yes, getting stronger, learning, growing into this harder version of herself. But she was also waiting, watching, like an animal that knows the trap hasn't sprung yet but can smell the steel beneath the snow. One morning in late December, Ethan came in from feeding the animals to find her standing at the kitchen table, staring at something in her hands. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just kept staring with an expression he couldn't read. "What is it?" he asked, stamping snow from his boots. She jumped, nearly dropping whatever she was holding. Her hands closed around it quickly, but not before he caught a glimpse of paper. Old paper, yellowed and creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. Nothing, just nothing. She moved to put it away, but her hands were shaking. "Lila, I said it's nothing. And I'm saying you're lying." He crossed the room, not fast enough to spook her, but with enough purpose that she knew he wasn't backing down. "What are you holding?" For a moment he thought she'd refuse, thought she'd close up the way she sometimes did when questions cut too close to whatever she was protecting. But then something in her seemed to break. and she sank into the chair like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "It's the contract," she said quietly. "The one my family signed. The one that says I belong to Victor Crowley." Ethan felt ice settle in his gut. "Where did you get that?" "I've always had it. Kept it hidden in the lining of my dress. The raiders didn't find it when they searched the wagons." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Stupid, right? The one thing I managed to save from that massacre, and it's the document that proves I'm property." "Why keep it?" "Because it's evidence, proof of what they did to me. And because—" She smoothed the paper on the table, her fingers tracing words he couldn't read from where he stood. "Because sometimes I needed to look at it, to remind myself that this nightmare is real, that I didn't imagine it, that my own family really did sell me like I was livestock." Ethan moved closer, looking over her shoulder at the document. It was written in formal legal language, dense and cold, but the meaning was clear enough. Eleanor Marie Vance, her real name, he noted, sold to Victor Crowley of Silver Creek for the sum of $3,000, to be delivered no later than October 15th, 1873. Terms and conditions outlined below. Terms and conditions for selling a human being. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. This isn't legal. Can't be. It is, though. Women are still considered property in most places, especially if they're widows with no means. The courts call it guardianship or sponsored relocation to make it sound respectable, but the reality is the same. Someone pays money, gets ownership, and the law backs it up. That's insane. That's America. She folded the contract back up with careful precision, like handling something fragile that might shatter. "My father's lawyer drew it up. Made sure every word was airtight, every loophole closed. He was very thorough, proud of his work even." "Your father knows about this?" "He arranged it, found Crowley through business connections, negotiated the price, signed the papers himself." Her voice had gone flat again, emotionless. The tone she used when talking about things too painful to feel. "My mother cried at the train station. Not because she disagreed. She never disagreed with my father about anything. Just because it was unseemly to conduct such business in public. Bad for appearances." Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. Rage was building in his chest, hot and sharp, directed at people he'd never met and never would. People who could do this to their own daughter and sleep soundly afterward. "Why 3,000?" he asked finally. "That was my father's asking price. What he calculated I owed him for my upbringing, my failed marriage, the embarrassment I'd caused by becoming a burden." She looked up at him, and her eyes were dry, past crying maybe, or just empty. Crowley negotiated him down from 5. My father was quite pleased with the final amount. Said I should be grateful he found someone willing to pay it all. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack stone. Outside, wind howled through the trees, driving snow against the windows. Inside, 2 people sat with the evidence of cruelty between them, trying to comprehend how the world could be this broken and still turn on its axis. "Does Crowley know you're alive?" Ethan asked. "I don't know. The wagons were late. We should have arrived by October 20th at the latest. It's December now. He either thinks I'm dead or he's looking for me. Maybe both. And if he finds you, then the contract is enforceable. He's already paid. I was already sold. The law will side with him, and I'll have to go." She met his eyes. "That's why I can't stay here forever, Ethan. Why I can't let myself get comfortable. Because eventually, someone will come. And when they do, running is the only option I'll have left." "What if you didn't run?" She blinked. "What? What if you stayed? Fought it?" "Fought what? The law? My family? Crowley's money and power?" She shook her head. "You don't fight people like that and win. You just get crushed." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do. I've lived in that world, Ethan. I know how it works. The rich make the rules, and people like me follow them or suffer. There's no third option." "There's always another option." "Name one." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because she was right, and they both knew it. The law was clear. Her family had authority over her as a widow. Crowley had a legal contract and the money to enforce it. Fighting that in court would require resources neither of them had, and even if they did, frontier justice rarely sided with women over wealthy men. But the thought of her leaving, of watching her ride off into danger because the law said she belonged to someone who'd bought her like cattle, made something in his chest twist painfully. "Then we make sure he doesn't find you," Ethan said. "For how long? A year? 5 years? The rest of my life?" Lila stood, pacing to the window. "I can't hide forever, and I can't ask you to shelter a fugitive indefinitely. That's not fair to you. I don't care about fair." "Well, I do." She turned back to him, and he saw something new in her expression. Not fear this time, something harder. Resolution. "You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. You saved my life, taught me to survive, gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go, but I won't make you a target for my problems. When spring comes and the pass is clear, I'm leaving. Going somewhere Crowley won't think to look. Canada, maybe, or California." "Alone?" "If I have to be." "You'll die out there." Maybe. Or maybe I'll survive. Either way, it's my choice to make." She crossed her arms, defensive. "I won't be owned again, Ethan. Not by Crowley, not by my family, not by anyone. I'd rather die free than live as someone's property." He understood that. Respected it even. But it didn't make the prospect of watching her leave any easier to swallow. "Spring's 4 months away," he said finally. "A lot can change in 4 months. Or nothing will change at all, and I'll still have to go. We'll see." She studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to read something written in a language she didn't fully speak. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't have a good answer. Didn't know how to explain that somewhere between teaching her to ride and watching her learn to shoot, she'd stopped being a stranger and become something else. Something he didn't have words for yet. "Because you're here," he said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "That's not a reason. It's the only one I've got." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "You said that before, about why you helped me." Still true. "You're a terrible liar, you know that?" Never claimed to be good at it. This time she did smile, just a flicker, gone almost before he saw it. But it was there. Real. The first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the day he found her in the ashes. "Come on," he said, breaking the moment before it could get heavier. "Enough sitting around feeling sorry for ourselves. Wood needs chopping, and I'm not doing it all myself." "I chopped wood yesterday." "Then you'll be good at it today." She groaned but followed him outside, pulling on the coat he'd given her. His old one, too big in the shoulders but warm enough to keep her alive in the cold. They worked in the yard for hours, splitting logs and stacking them against the cabin wall. Hard, simple work that didn't require thinking, just doing. By the time they finished, the sun was dropping behind the peaks and Lila was breathing hard, her cheeks flushed from exertion. She looked alive in a way she hadn't when he'd first found her. Solid. Present. Like she'd stepped back into her body after spending months as a ghost. "I'm going to be sore tomorrow," she said, flexing her hands. "You're sore every day. You just complain about it more when it's cold." "That's because cold makes everything worse. Wait until January. This is nothing." She made a face at him, and he felt that strange warmth in his chest again. The one that showed up more and more often lately, whenever she forgot to be scared and just existed alongside him like a partner instead of a refugee. Dangerous. That warmth was dangerous. Because warmth led to caring, and caring led to loss. And he'd already lost everyone he'd ever cared about. But knowing that didn't seem to stop it from happening anyway. They went inside as dusk settled over the valley. Lila started dinner while Ethan cleaned his rifle, both of them moving in the comfortable silence they'd developed over weeks of shared space. She hummed while she cooked, something he'd noticed she did when she thought he wasn't paying attention. An old melody, soft and sad, and somehow hopeful at the same time. "What's that song?" he asked. She looked up, surprised to be caught. "Just something my mother used to sing before everything." "It's nice." "You think so?" "My husband hated it, said it was common." "Your husband sounds like he was an ass." That got a real laugh out of her, short and sharp. "He was. Kind of a relief when he died, honestly. Is that terrible?" "Probably, but I'm not judging." She dished out stew, rabbit from the traps, potatoes from the root cellar, wild onions she'd found and dried before the snow came. Simple food, but good. Better than anything he'd made for himself in 3 years of living alone. They ate together at the table and she told him about Philadelphia. Not the bad parts this time, the parts she'd shared in darker moments. Tonight she talked about the good things, the libraries where she'd spent hours reading, the music halls where orchestras played on Friday nights, the parks where children flew kites in summer and couples walked arm in arm in fall. Do you miss it? Ethan asked. Parts of it. The culture. The books. Having more than 3 dresses. She poked at her stew. But not enough to go back. That life, it wasn't mine. It was something I wore because I was told to, like a costume I couldn't take off. Out here, She paused, searching for words. I'm becoming something real. Does that make sense? Like, more than you know. You feel that way too? About the frontier? About the quiet? About being far enough from people that you can hear yourself think? He set his spoon down. In town, everyone knew me as the man who lost his family. Everything I did, every conversation, it was colored by that. They pitied me, or avoided me, or tried to fix me, and all of it just made it worse. Out here, there's no one to perform for, no expectations except survival. Is that why you stayed, after it happened? Partly. Also because I couldn't stand to be where they'd died. Couldn't rebuild on ground that was soaked in their ashes. Wow. He stared into his coffee. I sold the land, bought this place, and disappeared. Been here ever since. Alone. By choice. Was it, though? A choice? She leaned forward slightly. Or was it punishment? Penance for something you think you deserve to suffer for? Does it matter? I think it does. Because if it's punishment, then you're just waiting to finish dying. But if it's a choice, then you can choose something different anytime you want. The observation cut deeper than he wanted to admit. You're too smart for your own good. My father said the same thing, right before he sold me to shut me up. They fell quiet after that, both retreating into thoughts too heavy to share. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire burned low, casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls. Later, after the dishes were washed and put away, Lila excused herself to bed. Ethan stayed by the fire like always, rifle across his lap, watching the flames and thinking about contracts and choices, and the strange twist of fate that had brought a broken woman to his door. He should let her go when spring came, should help her prepare, give her supplies, maybe even ride with her to the nearest town to make sure she got there safe. Then he should come back here alone and return to the quiet death he'd been living before she arrived. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But smart and safe had never kept anyone warm through a cold night, and the thought of this cabin without her in it felt like dying all over again. Sometime after midnight, he heard her moving in the other room. Not the sounds of nightmare. He'd learned to recognize those. Just restlessness. The shift of weight on an old mattress. The rustle of blankets being rearranged. He stood, moved to her door, knocked softly. You all right? A pause, then, can't sleep. Want company? Another pause, longer this time. Yes. He pushed the door open. She was sitting up in bed, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, looking small and lost in the darkness. Mind if I sit? He gestured to the chair by the window. Go ahead. He settled into the chair, stretching his legs out. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable with it. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the trees. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily still. Do you think he's looking for me? Lila asked finally. Crowley. Probably. And when he finds me? If he finds you, not when. When, she corrected firmly. Men like him don't give up. They can't afford to. If word got out that someone stole his property and got away with it, his reputation would be ruined. He'll hunt me to the ends of the earth just to prove he can. Then we'll make sure the earth is bigger than his reach. She pulled the blanket tighter. You keep saying we, like you're planning to be there. I am. Why? Because running alone is how you die. Running with someone who knows the land gives you a chance. That's still not a real answer, Ethan. He looked at her then, really looked. At the way the moonlight caught her hair, the strength that had grown in her face over the weeks, the fire in her eyes that hadn't been there when he found her. She wasn't the same terrified woman from the wagon massacre. She'd changed, grown, become someone worth fighting for. Or maybe she'd always been worth fighting for, and he was just now allowing himself to see it. Because I've spent 3 years punishing myself for people I couldn't save, he said quietly. Maybe it's time I tried saving someone I can. Her breath caught. I'm not your redemption, Ethan. I know, but maybe you're my reason to stop hiding from the world. And if I leave anyway, if spring comes and I ride out of here and you never see me again, then at least I'll know I tried, that I didn't just sit here and let the world take you without putting up a fight. He stood, moved to the door. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. Ethan? He paused, hand on the door frame. Thank you for all of this, for not asking me to be anything other than what I am. You don't have to thank me for treating you like a person. You'd be surprised how rare that is. He left her then, pulling the door closed behind him, went back to his chair by the fire and sat there until dawn, thinking about spring and choices and the way fate had a habit of putting people exactly where they needed to be, whether they wanted to be there or not. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine and quiet moments that felt too precious to name. They worked together, ate together, sat by the fire in the evenings while she read from the few books he had, and he cleaned weapons or mended tack. Small domesticities that added up to something neither of them could quite define, but both recognized as important. She laughed more often now, real laughs, not the bitter ones from before. She teased him about his cooking, about the way he talked to the mare like she could understand him, about his habit of checking the door 3 times before bed. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way she moved, the expressions that crossed her face, the sound of her voice when she forgot to be guarded. Building memories like a man who knew winter wouldn't last forever and wanted something to hold on to when the thaw came. And through it all, the contract sat hidden in her things. A reminder, a threat, a promise that this peace was temporary, that the world outside their valley hadn't forgotten her and wouldn't stop looking until she was found. One night in early January, she found him outside staring at the stars. The sky was clear, cold enough to burn, and the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Couldn't sleep? She asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Just thinking. About? Spring. What happens when the snow melts? She was quiet for a moment, then, we have time before then. Do we? I hope so. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cold air. I'm scared, Ethan. More scared than I've been since the massacre. Because back then, I had nothing to lose. Now you do. Yes. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I didn't want this. Didn't want to care about staying, about this place, about... She stopped, swallowed hard. I was supposed to keep moving, stay detached, but I can't anymore, and that terrifies me. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he rested his hand on her shoulder. Fear means you're alive, means you have something worth protecting. Or something worth losing. That too. She leaned into him slightly, seeking warmth or comfort or just the presence of another human being who understood what it meant to be broken and still breathing. He let her, this woman with a false name and a contract that said she belonged to someone else, because in that moment, under the stars, she belonged to no one but herself. And that was enough. They came on a Tuesday in late February when the snow was starting to thin and the first hints of thaw showed in the creek. Ethan saw the riders from a distance, 6 of them, dark shapes moving against white landscape like ink bleeding across paper. His blood went cold. Lila. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. She was at the window already, frozen, watching them come. Get inside, now! She didn't move. Couldn't, maybe. Just stood there staring at the approaching riders with the same look she'd had the day he found her, prey recognizing its predator. Eleanor. He used her real name, and that broke the spell. She turned to him, eyes wide with terror. Inside, hide the contract. Stay in the back room and don't come out until I tell you. He found me. You don't know that yet. I know. Her voice was hollow. I've been expecting this since the day I arrived. Part of me is almost relieved it's finally here. Eleanor, don't let him take me, Ethan. Whatever happens, don't let him put his hands on me. She grabbed his arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Promise me. If it comes to that, if there's no other way, I'd rather you… Stop. He covered her hand with his. No one's taking you anywhere, I promise. She searched his face for the lie, didn't find one, and nodded once. Then she was moving, disappearing into the cabin while Ethan walked out to meet the riders with his rifle in hand and his heart beating steady and cold as a winter stone. The lead rider pulled up 20 feet from the porch. He was a big man, well-fed and well-dressed despite the harsh conditions. His coat was fur-lined, his boots polished leather that had no business on the frontier. Behind him, 5 men sat their horses with the casual competence of hired guns. They wore their weapons like tools, not trophies. "You must be Ethan Hale," the big man said. His voice was cultured, educated, Eastern money dressed up in Western clothes. "I'm Victor Crowley. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Ethan kept his expression flat. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Crowley's smile was pleasant and utterly without warmth. "A woman, mid-20s, dark hair, refined features, survived a wagon attack last October and subsequently disappeared. My sources tell me she was seen in your company shortly after." "Your sources are wrong." "Are they?" Crowley pulled a paper from his coat, unfolded it with deliberate care. "I have here a legal contract, properly witnessed and notarized, stating that one Eleanor Marie Vance is my lawful property, purchased from her family for the sum of $3,000. That contract gives me certain rights, Mr. Hale. Rights I intend to exercise. The only right you've got is to turn that horse around and ride back where you came from." Crowley's pleasant expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and calculating. "I'm trying to be civilized about this. I know frontier hospitality can be possessive. Perhaps you found her, sheltered her, didn't realize she was spoken for. I'm willing to overlook that misunderstanding. Simply produce Eleanor and we can all go our separate ways. And if I don't? Then I'll be forced to conclude you're harboring stolen property. That's a crime, Mr. Hale. One I have the law on my side to address." He gestured to his men. "I didn't bring these gentlemen for decoration." Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. 6-1. Bad odds, made worse by the fact that Crowley was right. The law would side with a wealthy man holding a legal contract over a frontier rancher sheltering a runaway woman. But the law had let his family burn while he was gone. The law had done nothing when bandits raided settlements and left bodies in the dirt. The law was whatever the man with the most money said it was. And Ethan had learned long ago that out here, the only law that mattered was the one you were willing to enforce yourself. "I'll say this once," Ethan said quietly. "There's no woman here. You're on my land uninvited. You've got till the count of 10 to leave before I start treating you like the trespassers you are." Crowley's smile finally faded. "You're making a mistake." "Won't be my first." For a long moment, they stared at each other across 20 feet of snow-packed ground. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there with his rifle ready and his life already counted as forfeit if it came to shooting. Then Crowley raised a hand, stopping his men before they could draw. "Very well, if that's how you want to play this, we'll do it properly. I'll return with the marshal and a search warrant. When I find her, and I will find her, Mr. Hale, you'll be charged with theft and obstruction. Frontier justice may be rough, but it's still justice, and it will side with the man holding the legal papers." He turned his horse, the hired guns following suit. But before they rode off, Crowley looked back over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, I understand the impulse. Eleanor is quite beautiful when she's not being difficult. But beauty doesn't change ownership. Remember that." They rode away, 6 dark shapes receding into the distance. Ethan watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then lowered his rifle and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The cabin door opened behind him. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in his old coat, her face pale as the snow around them. "How long do we have?" "Day, maybe 2 if the weather slows them. Silver Creek's 20 miles south. He'll need to convince the marshal to ride out here in late winter, and that might take some doing." "But he'll convince him. Eventually. Men like Crowley usually get what they want." She walked out onto the porch, staring at the tracks the horses had left. "I should run, right now, before he comes back with the law." Where would you go? I don't know. North. Canada's supposed to be more lenient about these things. Canada's 1,000 miles through country that'll kill you before spring. And even if you made it, Crowley would just follow. Men like him don't stop because you cross a border. Then what do you suggest? She turned on him, fear sharpening into anger. Because standing here waiting for him to come back with armed men and legal authority seems like a terrible plan. It is, which is why we're not doing that. Then what are we doing? Ethan looked at her standing there in the cold, defiant, and terrified and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with the fire that kept burning no matter how much the world tried to snuff it out. He'd made a promise to protect her. Time to honor it. We're going to Silver Creek, he said, before he gets back. And we're going to end this on our terms, not his. Her eyes widened. That's insane. He'll have us arrested the moment we set foot in town. Maybe. Or maybe he's not as powerful as he thinks he is. Ethan started toward the barn. Either way, running won't solve this. That contract follows you wherever you go. The only way to be free is to break it, and we can't do that hiding in a cabin. How do you break a legal contract? I don't know yet, but I know someone who might. He saddled both horses while Eleanor packed what little they'd need: food, blankets, ammunition. Neither spoke much. There wasn't time for doubts or second-guessing. They'd made their choice the moment Crowley rode up to the cabin. Now they just had to live with the consequences. They rode out an hour later, heading south through country Ethan knew like the back of his hand. The snow was deep but manageable, and the horses were strong. If they pushed hard, they'd reach Silver Creek by nightfall, maybe an hour or two before Crowley and his men. Not much of an advantage, but it would have to be enough. Eleanor rode beside him in silence, her face set in grim determination. She'd learned to ride well enough over the winter that she didn't slow them down, didn't complain when the pace got rough, just held on and kept moving. This woman who'd never been allowed to fight for herself, learning what it meant to stop running and turn toward the threat instead. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat cold jerky and hardtack. Eleanor sat on a fallen log, staring at nothing. You're thinking too much, Ethan said. I'm thinking about what happens if this doesn't work. If we ride into town and Crowley has us both arrested, then we figure something else out. There might not be anything else to figure out. The law is the law, Ethan. You can't just ignore it because you don't like it. Watch me. She almost smiled at that. Almost. You're a stubborn man, you know that? So I've been told. It's going to get you killed someday. Probably, but not today. He stood, offered her his hand. Come on. We're burning daylight. She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. They stood close for a moment, close enough that he could see the fear behind her bravado, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. What if he wins? What if the law sides with him and I have to... He won't win. Ethan cupped her face, made her look at him. I promise you, Eleanor, whatever happens, you're not going back to him. Not as property, not as anything. You can't promise that. I just did. She closed her eyes, leaned into his touch for just a second. Then she pulled away, climbed back on her horse, and they rode on. Silver Creek appeared as the sun was dropping toward the mountains. It was a rough frontier town, built around mining and cattle and the railroad that had pushed through 5 years back. 2 streets of wooden buildings, a hotel, a saloon, a general store, and the marshal's office with its small jail attached. Ethan led them straight to the marshal's office and dismounted. Eleanor followed, her movement stiff from the cold and the ride. Let me do the talking, Ethan said. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to let me try this my way first. She nodded reluctantly and followed him inside. Marshal Tom Briggs was a weathered man in his 50s, lean and hard with the kind of face that had seen too much violence to be impressed by threats. He looked up from his desk when they entered, his eyes narrowing when he saw Eleanor. Ethan Hale. Been a while. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. And you must be the woman causing all the trouble. Word travels fast, Ethan said. Crowley sent a rider ahead, said he's coming back with paperwork and expectations. Briggs leaned back in his chair. Said you were harboring his property and refusing to cooperate. His property? Eleanor's voice was ice. Is that what he called me? His words, not mine. Briggs studied her carefully. You, Eleanor Vance? I am. And you're running from a legal contract that says you belong to Victor Crowley? I'm running from being treated like cattle, yes. Briggs was quiet for a moment, then sighed. Look, miss, I sympathize. I do. But the law's pretty clear on these things. If Crowley has proper documentation, and he says he does, then I can't just ignore it because you don't like the terms. The terms are that I was sold by my own family to a man I never met, Eleanor said, her voice rising. The terms are that I'm expected to submit to being owned, to having no rights, no voice, no choice in my own life. Those aren't terms anyone should have to accept. I agree. But my job isn't to change the law, it's to enforce it. Even when the law is wrong, especially then. Because the moment I start picking and choosing which laws to enforce based on my personal feelings, I stop being a marshal and start being a dictator. He looked genuinely sorry. I'm going to have to ask you to stay in town until Crowley arrives with his documentation. If it's legitimate, I'll have no choice but to turn you over to him. Ethan stepped forward. And if we refuse? Then I'll arrest you both for obstruction and hold you until this gets sorted out. Don't make me do that, Ethan. You're a good man. Don't throw your life away over this. My life's already been thrown away. At least this way it means something. Before Briggs could respond, the door burst open. A young deputy stuck his head in, breathing hard. Marshal, riders coming in. 6 of them, led by Crowley. Briggs stood. Damn, I was hoping we'd have more time. He looked at Ethan and Eleanor. You two stay here. I'll talk to Crowley, see what he's got. Maybe there's a way to sort this without it getting ugly. There isn't, Eleanor said flatly. Men like him don't compromise. Maybe, but I have to try. He walked out, leaving them alone in the office. Through the window, Ethan watched Crowley and his men ride up, dismounting with the confidence of people who knew they held all the cards. This isn't going to work, Eleanor said. He'll show Briggs the contract, Briggs will verify it's legal, and that'll be the end of it. Not if you have something to say about it. What can I say that will change a legal document? The truth, publicly, where everyone can hear it. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You want me to make a scene. I want you to make them see you as a person, not property. Harder to enforce a contract when the whole town's watching and judging. He moved to the window. Crowley's power comes from people being too intimidated or too indifferent to stand up to him. Take that away, and he's just another man with money. You're asking me to humiliate myself in front of strangers. I'm asking you to fight, to use the only weapon you've got, your voice. Make them hear you, Eleanor. Make them see what this really is. She was quiet, staring at the floor. Then she straightened, lifted her chin, and walked to the door. Then let's not waste time. She stepped outside before he could stop her, out onto the street where Crowley was talking to Briggs, showing him papers. The hired guns stood nearby, watchful and ready. Eleanor's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. You want to talk about me like I'm not here? Fine. Let's make this official. Every head turned. Crowley's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. Eleanor, how civilized of you to finally show yourself. Civilization is your word, not mine. You wouldn't know civilization if it bit you. Careful. His voice went cold. You're already in enough trouble without making it worse. Worse than being sold like livestock? Worse than being hunted down and dragged back to a man who thinks money gives him the right to own another human being. She took a step forward, and Ethan saw people starting to gather, drawn by the raised voices, a crowd forming, witnesses. Tell them, Mr. Crowley. Tell everyone here what you paid for me, how much a woman costs in your world. Crowley's jaw tightened. This is a private matter. No, it's not. You made it public the moment you rode into this town with armed men and legal papers. So let's make it really public. Let's have everyone know exactly what kind of man you are. More people now. Shopkeepers, miners, women with children, all watching, listening, the crowd growing larger by the second. Briggs stepped forward. Miss Vance, maybe we should what? Discuss this quietly while Mr. Crowley and his lawyers decide my fate? I don't think so. She turned to the crowd, and her voice rang out clear and strong. My name is Eleanor Vance. 3 months ago, I was put on a wagon and shipped west like cargo. Why? Because my husband died in debt and my family decided I was an embarrassment they could profit from. They drew up a contract, found a buyer, and sold me $3,000. That's what they decided I was worth. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan saw faces changing, saw people starting to understand what they were witnessing. The buyer was this man, Eleanor pointed at Crowley. Victor Crowley, a man who believes that having money gives him the right to purchase human beings, a man who calls himself civilized while treating women like cattle. That's enough. Crowley's voice was hard now, the pleasant mask cracking. Marshal, I have legal documentation. This woman is my property according to the law. I demand you enforce it. Your property, Eleanor laughed, sharp and bitter. You hear that? Not a person, not a woman, property. And all of you are just going to stand there and watch while he drags me away because some paper says he owns me? The crowd was larger now, pressing closer. Ethan saw anger on some faces, uncertainty on others, saw people looking at Crowley differently, seeing him not as a wealthy businessman, but as something uglier. The law is clear, Crowley started. The law is wrong. Eleanor's voice cracked like thunder. And if you enforce it, Marshal Briggs, if you hand me over to this man because some contract says you have to, then you're no better than the people who wrote that contract in the first place. Briggs looked torn, caught between duty and conscience. Miss Vance, I understand your position, but do you really understand what it's like to have your own family sell you? To be treated like you're not even human? To know that everything you are, everything you could be, doesn't matter because some man decided you belong to him? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but her voice never wavered. I refuse. You hear me? I refuse to be owned. I refuse to accept that any person has the right to buy and sell another. I refuse to be quiet and obedient and grateful for whatever scraps of humanity you decide to throw me. The crowd was with her now. Ethan could feel it, the shift in the air. People were angry, moved, shaken by her words. This wasn't just about a legal contract anymore. It was about something bigger, something that touched the conscience of everyone watching. Crowley felt it too. His face had gone red, fury barely contained. This is absurd. Marshal, I demand. You demand? A woman's voice from the crowd. You come here with your papers and your guns and demand we hand over a human being like she's a horse you purchased? The law can go to hell. Another voice, male this time. I didn't fight to build this territory so rich men could buy and sell people like we're still in the Dark Ages. More voices now, rising in agreement. The crowd pressing closer, anger building. Crowley's hired guns shifted nervously, hands on weapons but uncertain what to do against dozens of angry townspeople. Briggs raised his hands. Everyone calm down. We'll handle this proper. Proper? Eleanor cut him off. What's proper about this? About any of this? She turned back to Crowley, and her eyes blazed with a fury Ethan had never seen before. You want me? Then take me. Right here, in front of all these people. Show them who you really are. Show them the man who buys women and calls it legal. Crowley took a step toward her, and the crowd surged forward. Touch her and see what happens, someone shouted. We don't hold with slavery here, another voice added. Crowley stopped, his face twisted with rage and something else. Something Ethan recognized, the dawning realization that he'd lost control of the situation, that his money and his papers and his hired guns weren't enough against a crowd that had decided he was wrong. This isn't over, Crowley snarled. I have legal recourse. Then use it somewhere else, Briggs said quietly. The marshal had made his choice, Ethan realized, seen which way the wind was blowing and decided that keeping the peace was more important than enforcing a law that had just turned his whole town against him. Because right now, I'm looking at a situation that's about to turn violent, and I don't think your legal recourse is worth people dying over. You're refusing to enforce the law. I'm refusing to start a riot over a contract that might not even be valid in this territory. Colorado has different laws than Pennsylvania, Mr. Crowley. Maybe you should take your paperwork to a judge and get a proper ruling before you come into my town making demands. It was a dodge, a way to buy time and save face. But it was enough. Crowley knew it, and the fury in his eyes said he understood he'd been outmaneuvered. This isn't over, he repeated, but the words were hollow now, empty threats from a man who'd just learned that power had limits. He turned to his men. We're leaving, but this conversation isn't finished, Miss Vance. Count on that. They mounted up and rode out, 6 men retreating from a fight they couldn't win. The crowd watched them go, then slowly dispersed, people drifting back to their lives, to their shops and homes and ordinary days. Eleanor stood in the middle of the street, still crying, shaking so hard Ethan thought she might collapse. He moved to her side, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You did it," he said quietly. "Did I?" Her voice was hollow. "He'll be back, with more lawyers, more power, and next time there might not be a crowd to protect me. Maybe, but today you won. Today you stood up and refused to be owned. That's not nothing." She leaned against him, exhausted, and he felt how much that confrontation had cost her, how much courage it had taken to stand there and bare her soul to strangers. Briggs approached, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Vance, you should know what I said about getting a judge involved. That wasn't just to get rid of Crowley. Contract law is complicated, especially when it crosses state lines. You might have a case if you can prove duress or that the contract violates territorial statutes." "Might," Eleanor repeated bitterly. "It's more than you had an hour ago." Briggs glanced at Ethan. "You two should stay in town tonight. Let things settle. I'll send word to the territorial judge, see if we can get a ruling before Crowley comes back with reinforcements. And if the judge sides with him, then we'll deal with that when it happens. For now, you bought yourself time. Use it." He walked away, leaving them standing in the street as dusk settled over the town. Eleanor was still trembling, still crying, but there was something different in her eyes now. Not fear this time, relief, and exhaustion, and the faint, fragile beginning of hope. They took a room at the hotel, the only one available, a small space with a single bed and a window overlooking the street. Eleanor sat on the edge of the mattress, still shaking from the confrontation, while Ethan stood watch by the window. "He's still out there," she said quietly. "I can feel it. Watching. Waiting. Probably. Men like Crowley don't give up easy." Ethan scanned the street below. Lamplight spilled from the saloon across the way, casting long shadows. "But he won't try anything tonight. Too many witnesses, too much attention. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we see what the judge says." Eleanor laughed, sharp and bitter. "You really think a judge is going to rule against a legal contract? Against money and influence and everything Crowley represents? I think we made people see you today. Really see you. That counts for something." "Does it? Or did we just delay the inevitable?" She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "I'm so tired, Ethan. Tired of running. Tired of fighting. Tired of being afraid every second of every day." He moved from the window, sat in the chair beside the bed. "I know." "Do you? Do you really know what it's like to be owned? To have your entire existence reduced to a transaction?" "No. But I know what it's like to lose everything. To feel like you're already dead, but your body just hasn't caught up yet." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And I know that giving up is easy. Staying alive when everything hurts, that's the hard part. That's the part that takes courage." She turned her head to look at him. "You think I'm brave?" "I think you stood in front of an entire town and told them the truth when you could have stayed quiet. Yeah, I think you're brave." Tears welled in her eyes again. "I didn't feel brave. I felt terrified." "That's what brave is. Doing the thing that scares you because it's the right thing to do." She reached out, her hand finding his. He held it, this small gesture of comfort that somehow meant more than words. They sat like that in the quiet of the room, two broken people holding on to each other because it was all they had left. After a while, Eleanor fell into exhausted sleep, still dressed, still holding his hand. Ethan stayed in the chair, keeping watch through the night like he'd done back at the cabin. Old habits. The kind that kept you alive when danger was always one bad decision away. Morning came gray and cold. Eleanor woke stiff and disoriented, the events of the previous day settling over her like a weight. Ethan had coffee waiting, bad hotel coffee, but hot. "Briggs sent word," he said. "Judge Miller's in town, wants to see us at 10. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the cup. "And Crowley?" "Probably already there, laying out his case." "Then it's over. He'll have his lawyers, his documents, his witnesses. What do we have?" "The truth." "The truth doesn't win against money, Ethan. You know that." "Maybe. But it's all we've got, so we use it. They walked to the courthouse just before 10. The building was small, more of a town hall than a proper courthouse, but it served. Inside, a clerk directed them to the main room, where Judge Miller was already seated behind a rough wooden desk. He was an older man, 60 or so, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human ugliness the frontier could offer. Crowley was there too, seated with two men in expensive suits. Lawyers, clearly. They had stacks of papers spread before them, organized and official-looking. Behind them sat the hired guns, quiet and watchful. The room was packed. Word had spread overnight, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to witness what happened next. Ethan saw faces from yesterday's crowd, the woman who'd spoken up, the man who'd called the law to hell, saw Briggs standing near the door, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. Judge Miller gestured for them to approach. "Mr. Crowley, you've brought a complaint regarding ownership of one Eleanor Vance, correct?" "I have, Your Honor." Crowley's lawyer stood, a thin man with a voice like oil. "My client holds a legal contract, properly executed in Philadelphia under Pennsylvania law, establishing his ownership of the defendant. She was purchased from her family for the sum of $3,000 and was being transported to his property when she absconded during a criminal attack on the transport wagons." "Absconded." Eleanor's voice cut through the legal speak. "I hid under a trunk while raiders murdered everyone around me." "That's what you call absconding?" The lawyer ignored her. "The contract is clear and binding. We request that Miss Vance be remanded to Mr. Crowley's custody immediately and that Mr. Hale be charged with harboring stolen property." "Stolen property?" Eleanor stood, and Ethan saw the fire from yesterday burning in her eyes again. "Your Honor, I'm not property. I'm a human being." "The law says otherwise," the lawyer countered smoothly. "Colorado territory recognizes contracts executed in other states. This contract is legal and enforceable." Judge Miller looked at the papers before him, then at Eleanor. "Miss Vance, is it true that you signed this contract willingly?" "Willingly?" She laughed, harsh. "I was a widow with no money, no prospects, and a family that saw me as a burden. I was told to sign or be disowned completely. Is that willing?" "Duress is difficult to prove," the lawyer said, "especially when the contract clearly states, 'I don't care what the contract states.'" Eleanor's voice rose. "It's wrong. Selling people is wrong. Owning people is wrong. And enforcing this contract is wrong." "Your Honor," the lawyer pressed, "the defendant's emotional state is understandable, but it doesn't change the legal facts. Mr. Crowley has fulfilled his obligations under the contract. Miss Vance must fulfill hers." The judge was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor. Then he looked at Crowley. "Mr. Crowley, what exactly do you intend to do with Miss Vance if she's returned to your custody?" Crowley stood, smoothing his vest. "She will serve as my household manager and companion as outlined in the contract. I'm a busy man, Your Honor. I need someone to run my home, entertain my guests, manage my affairs. That's what I paid for." "Companion." Eleanor's voice dripped with contempt. "Say what you really mean. You paid for a wife you can control. A woman who has to do whatever you say because a piece of paper gives you that right." "I paid for services rendered according to a legal agreement." "You paid to own a human being." Eleanor turned to the crowd. "And all of you are going to watch while he gets away with it? While the law says that's acceptable?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan saw the same anger from yesterday starting to build again. Saw people looking at Crowley with disgust. The judge banged his gavel. "Order. Miss Vance, I understand your position, but this is a court of law. I can't rule based on emotion, then rule based on justice," Eleanor interrupted. "Rule based on the fact that no person should own another, that no amount of money gives someone that right, that these contracts are remnants of a time we should be ashamed of, not defending in court." "The law is clear. The law is wrong." She slammed her hand on the desk. "And if you uphold it, if you enforce this contract, then you're telling every woman in this territory that she can be bought and sold if someone has enough money and the right paperwork. Is that the precedent you want to set, Your Honor?" Judge Miller's face was unreadable. He looked at Crowley, at the lawyers, at the contract spread before him. Then he looked at Eleanor, really looked, like he was seeing her for the first time. "Your Honor," Crowley's lawyer said, sensing hesitation. The law is unambiguous. Colorado Territory has no statute invalidating contracts of this nature executed in other jurisdictions. You must enforce. Must I? The judge's voice was quiet but carried weight. I'm looking at this contract, Mr. Morrison, and I'm seeing language that's extremely specific. Services rendered as household manager and companion. That's the phrase used repeatedly. Yes, Your Honor. Standard language for such agreements. Except Miss Vance isn't a housekeeper you can hire and fire. She's a person whose entire life you're claiming to own. He flipped through the papers. And I'm also seeing that this contract was executed under Pennsylvania law, which has very specific statutes about what constitutes valid consent. Ethan felt a shift in the room. The lawyer felt it too. Your Honor, I assure you the contract was properly... Was Miss Vance's signature witnessed by an independent party? Someone not employed by or related to her family? Silence. The lawyer shuffled papers. I believe, because Pennsylvania law requires independent verification for contracts involving transfer of guardianship or long-term servitude. Without that, the contract could be considered void. The lawyer's face had gone pale. That's a technicality. The law is built on technicalities, Mr. Morrison. You know that. Judge Miller looked at Eleanor. Miss Vance, who witnessed your signature on this document? My father's lawyer, the same man who drew up the contract for him. And was he independent, or was he employed by your family? He'd worked for my father for 20 years. The judge nodded slowly. Then, by the letter of Pennsylvania law, this contract may not be valid. The witness was not independent, which calls into question whether Miss Vance's consent was freely given or coerced. Crowley stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is absurd. The contract has been accepted as valid in Pennsylvania, but we're not in Pennsylvania, Mr. Crowley. We're in Colorado Territory, and I have discretion to examine the validity of out-of-state contracts before enforcing them. He set the papers down. And I'm not comfortable enforcing a document that may violate the very laws it claims to be based on. You're making a mistake, Crowley said, and for the first time, Ethan heard desperation in his voice. I have rights. You have a questionable contract and a lot of money. Those aren't the same as rights. The judge looked at Eleanor. Miss Vance, do you consent to being returned to Mr. Crowley's custody? Absolutely not. Then, as far as I'm concerned, this contract is invalid until proven otherwise in a proper Pennsylvania court with all parties present and independently represented. He banged his gavel. Case dismissed. Miss Vance is free to go. The room erupted. People cheering, lawyers protesting, Crowley shouting over the noise. Eleanor stood frozen, like she couldn't process what had just happened. Your Honor, I protest. Crowley's lawyer was on his feet. You can't simply dismiss a legal contract. I just did. Appeal it if you like, but until a higher court tells me otherwise, my ruling stands. Judge Miller stood. This court is adjourned. He walked out, leaving chaos in his wake. Crowley turned on Eleanor, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over. You think you've won? You've won nothing. I'll appeal this to every court in the territory, every judge I can buy. Then do it, Eleanor said quietly. But you don't own me. Not today. Maybe not ever. You're making an enemy you can't afford. I already had you as an enemy. Nothing's changed except now everyone knows what you are. Crowley stared at her, and Ethan saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Saw him weighing options, measuring risks. The room was still full of people, all watching, all judging. His power had always come from operating in shadows, from making deals in private where no one could see. But Eleanor had dragged him into the light, and light burned away secrets. You'll regret this, Crowley said finally, but the words were hollow, empty threats from a man who'd just lost publicly. He turned and walked out, his lawyers and hired guns following. The crowd parted to let them pass, and Ethan saw faces watching him go, contempt, disgust, satisfaction. Crowley had been revealed, and that revelation had cost him something money couldn't buy back, reputation. Eleanor swayed, and Ethan caught her before she fell. She was crying again, but these were different tears. Relief. Exhaustion. The weight of months of fear finally lifted. Is it real? She whispered. Am I really free? For now, Ethan said honestly. He might appeal. might find another way. But today I'm free. Yes, today you're free. She clung to him, and he held her while the crowd dispersed around them, people offering congratulations and support. The woman from yesterday approached, older with kind eyes. That took courage, what you did, she said to Eleanor. Standing up like that, a lot of women wouldn't have. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. You chose to fight. That matters. They left the courthouse and walked back toward the hotel in silence. The sun had broken through the clouds, warming the cold air, and Silver Creek looked almost peaceful, almost normal. What happens now? Eleanor asked. Now we wait and see if Crowley makes good on his threats. See if he really does appeal. And if he does, then we deal with it, same as we've been dealing with everything else. Ethan looked at her. But you heard what the judge said. The contract might not even be legal. That's more than we had yesterday. It's still not freedom, not real freedom, just temporary relief. Sometimes that's all you get. Moments of relief between the hard parts. You take them when they come. They reached the hotel and Eleanor stopped at the bottom of the steps. I need to tell you something. Ethan waited. When I was standing in that courtroom waiting for the judge to decide my fate, I realized something. She took a breath. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every woman who's ever been treated like property, every person who's been told they don't matter, and that felt bigger than just me. It was bigger than just you. You gave those people permission to care, to stand up against something they knew was wrong but didn't know how to fight. I couldn't have done it without you. Yes, you could have. You just didn't know it yet. She smiled then, real and genuine. You have a lot of faith in me for someone who's only known me a few months. I've seen what you're made of. That's enough. They went inside, and for the first time since Crowley had ridden up to the cabin, Eleanor seemed to breathe easy. The fear was still there. Ethan could see it lurking in her eyes, but it was quieter now. Manageable. They spent the day in town, restocking supplies and talking to people who wanted to express their support. The shopkeeper gave Eleanor fabric for a new dress, refusing payment. The hotel owner waived their room fee, small kindnesses that added up to something larger. By evening, word came from Briggs. Crowley and his men had left Silver Creek, heading east. Whether he was giving up or regrouping, no one knew. But he was gone, and that was enough for now. Eleanor stood at the window of their room, watching the sun set over the mountains. Ethan came to stand beside her. We should head back tomorrow, he said, before the weather turns again. Back to the cabin. Unless you want to stay in town. She was quiet for a moment. No, I want to go back to the valley, to... She paused. To home. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Home. Not a shelter. Not a hiding place. Home. Then we'll go back, Ethan said. They left at dawn, riding north through country that was starting to show signs of spring. The snow was melting in the lower elevations, and water ran everywhere, in creeks and gullies and places that had been dry for months. The land was waking up, coming back to life, just like they were. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. It looked the same as when they'd left, small and rough and isolated. But seeing it made something settle in Ethan's chest, made him realize how much he'd grown to think of this place not as a tomb for his past, but as a foundation for whatever came next. Eleanor dismounted and stood looking at the cabin for a long moment. Then she turned to him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said, for believing me, for standing with me, for not treating me like I was crazy or difficult or too much trouble. You were definitely too much trouble, Ethan said, trying to lighten the moment. Still are, she laughed. Probably. But you took me in anyway. Seemed like the right thing to do. It was. It really was. She moved closer to him. I don't know what happens next. If Crowley comes back, if the contract gets upheld somewhere else, if I have to run again. But I know that right now, in this moment, I'm free. And that's because of you. It's because of you. I just gave you space to find your own strength. Then thank you for that too. They stood in the fading light, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and somehow built something worth protecting. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe never. But it was real, solid, the kind of connection that came from surviving together. And in a world as harsh and unforgiving as the frontier, that was more than most people ever got. They went inside, and Eleanor started a fire while Ethan unloaded the horses. Simple tasks, familiar now. They moved around each other easily, comfortable in the shared space. That night, they sat by the fire like they had so many nights before. But something was different. The fear that had always lurked in Eleanor's eyes was gone, replaced by something calmer. Not peace exactly. They'd both been through too much for peace. But acceptance, maybe. The understanding that she'd fought and won, at least for today. "What will you do if he comes back?" she asked. "Same thing I did this time, stand with you. Even if it costs you everything?" "I already lost everything 3 years ago. Whatever happens now is just borrowed time." She reached over, took his hand. "Then let's make the most of it, however long it lasts." He squeezed her hand, this simple gesture that somehow meant more than grand declarations. They sat like that while the fire burned low and the stars came out overhead, two survivors who'd found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. Outside, spring was coming. The snow was melting, the passes would clear soon, and the world would open up again. But for now, in this moment, they had shelter. They had safety. They had each other. And that was enough. Spring arrived in full force over the next few weeks, transforming the valley from white silence into rushing water and green life. The creek swelled with snowmelt, carving new channels through the meadow. Wildflowers pushed through the wet earth, lupine and columbine and Indian paintbrush. The air smelled of pine sap and wet soil and possibility. Eleanor worked in the garden, turning over earth that hadn't been planted in 3 years. She moved with purpose now, her hands confident with the tools, her body strong from months of frontier life. The refined Philadelphia woman who'd arrived broken and terrified had been reshaped into something harder, more resilient, someone who knew how to survive. Ethan watched her from the porch, mending harness leather that should have been replaced years ago. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and dirt streaked her face, but she was smiling, really smiling, not the careful half-expression she'd worn for so long. "You're staring again," she called out without looking up. "Just making sure you're not planting in the flooding zone." "I know where the flooding zone is. You showed me 3 times. And yet you keep getting close to it." She straightened, hands on her hips. "Are you going to supervise all day, or are you actually going to help?" "Supervising is helping." "No, it's annoying." But she was grinning. "Come on, these seed potatoes won't plant themselves." He set the harness aside and joined her in the garden. They worked side by side in companionable silence, the kind that came from months of learning each other's rhythms. She worked methodically, making straight rows. He worked faster, but messier, and she kept correcting his spacing. "You're doing it wrong," she said for the 3rd time. "It's dirt and potatoes. There's no wrong way." "There absolutely is. Look, you're crowding them. They need room to grow." "They're potatoes, Eleanor. They grow underground. They don't know they're crowded." She shook her head but smiled. "You're impossible." "You've mentioned that." They planted until the sun was high and hot, then took a break in the shade of the cabin. Eleanor brought out water and the last of the bread she'd baked that morning. They sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching, watching the valley come alive around them. "It's beautiful here," Eleanor said quietly. "I didn't see it at first, too scared to notice. But now—" She gestured at the mountains, the meadow, the endless sky. "I can't imagine being anywhere else. That might change when winter comes again. Maybe, or maybe I'll have learned to appreciate the quiet by then." She looked at him. "Do you ever think about leaving, going back to civilization?" "Used to. First year after the fire, I thought about it constantly. Thought maybe if I went somewhere new, somewhere without memories, it would hurt less." He took a drink of water. "Then I realized the memories followed me no matter where I went. So I stopped running and just stayed. And now? Now I'm not running from anything. I'm just here." He paused. "With you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural between them. "I'm glad you stayed. Glad you were here when I needed someone." "Me too." They sat like that for a while, comfortable in the silence. Then Eleanor pulled back, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Ethan, we need to talk about what happens if Crowley comes back." "He won't." "You don't know that." Been 2 months since Silver Creek. If he was coming back, he'd have done it by now. Or he's waiting, planning. Men like him don't forget humiliation. She twisted her hands in her lap. I need to know what we're going to do if he shows up with different lawyers, different judges, different ways to enforce that contract. Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he stood and walked inside, returning with a small metal box. He opened it and pulled out papers. The deed to his land, some old letters, and at the bottom the contract Eleanor had shown him months ago. She stared at it. I thought I hid that. You did. I found it when I was looking for spare blankets. He held it up. This is what you're afraid of, right? This piece of paper that says you belong to someone? Yes. He walked to the fire pit where they burned trash, struck a match, and set the contract alight. The old paper caught quickly, flames consuming the words that had haunted Eleanor for so long. They watched it burn down to ash, then blow away on the wind. There, Ethan said. No more contract. Eleanor's eyes were wide. That was evidence. The only proof that the contract existed. Exactly. But Crowley has copies. His lawyers have copies. Probably. But you don't anymore. And without the original document with your actual signature, it's a lot harder to prove anything. He sat back down beside her. Besides, that contract was already ruled questionable in court. Crowley knows that. He knows trying to enforce it means more public battles, more people seeing what he really is. Men like him thrive in shadows. You dragged him into the light, and that light showed everyone what he was willing to do for ownership. That doesn't mean he'll give up. No, but it means he has to weigh whether you're worth the cost to his reputation. And from what I saw in that courthouse, his reputation already took a beating. Ethan took her hand. You won, Eleanor. Maybe not forever, maybe not permanently, but you won. And sometimes that's enough to make people move on to easier targets. She stared at the ashes where the contract had been, tears streaming down her face. I want to believe that. Then believe it. Choose to believe it. He cupped her face, made her look at him. You've spent months living in fear of what might happen. Maybe it's time to start living like you're already free. I don't know how. Then learn. Same way you learned everything else out here. One day at a time. She kissed him then, sudden and fierce, pouring months of fear and hope and gratitude into the gesture. He kissed her back. This woman who'd fought her way from broken to whole, who'd stood in front of a town and claimed her own humanity when the world tried to strip it away. When they pulled apart, she was crying and laughing at the same time. I'm staying, for real this time. Not just until spring, not just until something better comes along. I'm choosing to stay. You sure? Valley gets cold in winter. Isolated. Lonely. I've been lonely in ballrooms full of people. I'd rather be here with you. Something in Ethan's chest loosened, a knot he'd been carrying since the fire finally beginning to unravel. Okay then, you stay. Just like that? Just like that. She laughed again, bright and free, and stood up. Then we should probably finish planting those potatoes. If I'm staying for winter, I'm going to need food. They went back to the garden and worked until dusk, talking about plans for the ranch. Eleanor wanted to expand the garden, maybe get chickens for eggs. Ethan talked about fixing the fence line, clearing more land for grazing. Future plans. Plans that assumed they'd both be here to see them through. That night, Eleanor moved her things from the guest room to Ethan's room without discussion or ceremony, just carried her few possessions across the hall and set them beside his. When he raised an eyebrow, she shrugged. If I'm staying, I'm staying. No more pretending we're just housemates waiting for circumstances to change. Fair enough. They fell into new rhythms after that. Working together during the day, cooking and eating together in the evening, falling asleep side by side at night. It wasn't the passionate romance of storybooks. It was something quieter, deeper. Partnership forged in survival and tempered by shared trauma. Love, maybe, though neither of them said the word. They'd both learned that words were cheap. Actions mattered more. 3 weeks after the contract burned, a rider appeared on the ridge. Ethan saw him first and felt the old wariness return. Eleanor saw his expression and went pale. Is it? Don't know yet. Stay inside. He grabbed his rifle and walked out to meet whoever was coming. The rider was alone, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. As he got closer, Ethan recognized the uniform. Marshal Briggs. The marshal pulled up and dismounted, looking tired and dusty from the road. Ethan. Miss Vance still here? She is. What do you want with her? Just to talk. Got news she'll want to hear. Briggs looked past him at the cabin. She around? Eleanor appeared in the doorway, rifle in her own hands. She'd learned to shoot well over the winter, and the weapon didn't look out of place in her grip anymore. I'm here, Marshal. What news? Briggs pulled an envelope from his saddlebag. Got this from the territorial governor's office last week. Took me a while to track you down. He handed it to Eleanor. Seems Judge Miller's ruling got some attention in higher circles. The governor's legal counsel reviewed the case and issued an opinion. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the envelope. She read in silence, her expression shifting from fear to disbelief to something that might have been joy. What does it say? Ethan asked. It says, her voice cracked, it says the territorial government has determined that contracts involving human servitude executed outside Colorado territory are not enforceable within its borders unless both parties willingly agree to be bound by them. It says that my refusal to consent means the contract has no legal standing here. Basically, the territory is saying it won't enforce ownership of people, Briggs added. The governor was pretty clear about that. Got tired of wealthy men bringing questionable contracts from back east and expecting frontier law to uphold them. So I'm free? Legally free? In Colorado territory, yes. Crowley or your family might still try to enforce the contract in Pennsylvania, but as long as you stay west, they've got no power over you. Eleanor sank onto the porch steps, the letter clutched in her hands. I can't believe it. After everything, it's really over? It's over, Briggs confirmed. Crowley left the territory 2 weeks ago. Word is he's looking for easier property acquisitions in California. Guess he decided you weren't worth the fight. Or he realized he couldn't win, Ethan said quietly. That too. Briggs looked at Eleanor. What you did in that courtroom, standing up like that, it got people talking. Got the governor's office asking questions about how many other women were being trafficked through the territory under legal pretenses. Your case started something bigger than just your freedom. Eleanor was crying again, but these were different tears. Relief, joy, the kind of tears that came when a weight you'd carried for so long finally lifted. Thank you, she managed, for bringing this, for everything. Just doing my job. Though between you and me, I'm glad it worked out this way. Never sat right with me, the idea of enforcing ownership. He tipped his hat. You two take care. And Miss Vance, welcome to Colorado territory. Officially. He rode off, leaving them standing in the yard with the letter that changed everything. Eleanor read it 3 more times, like she couldn't quite believe the words wouldn't change if she looked away. It's real, she finally said. I'm really free. Ethan pulled her into his arms. You've been free since the day you decided to fight back. This just makes it official. She clung to him, and he felt the last of the tension drain from her body. The fear that had lived in her eyes for months was gone, replaced by something he'd never seen there before. Peace. That night, they celebrated with a dinner that used up half their supplies: venison steaks, the last of the winter potatoes fried in bacon grease, bread with real butter that Eleanor had churned herself. They ate until they were stuffed, laughing at nothing and everything, drunk on relief and possibility. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The valley was quiet except for the creek and the wind in the pines, the kind of quiet that used to feel like loneliness but now felt like sanctuary. What do you want to do? Ethan asked. Now that you can do anything? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking. I want to stay here, build something real, maybe help other women who are running from situations like mine. She looked at him. Is that crazy? Wanting to use what I went through to help others? No, it's brave. I don't feel brave, I just feel like I need to do something with this second chance. Make it mean something. Then we'll figure out how, together. She leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence. No more fear, no more running. Just 2 people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something worth keeping. The weeks turned into months. Summer came in full, and the garden flourished under Eleanor's care. She planted flowers alongside the vegetables, useless pretty things that served no purpose except to make her smile. Ethan gave her grief about wasting space, but he secretly loved seeing color in the yard again. A woman showed up in early July, thin and frightened, asking for Eleanor by name. Word had spread somehow, through the traveling merchants, through the mining camps, through the whispered networks that connected desperate women across the frontier. Word that there was a place in the valley where women running from bad situations could find shelter. Eleanor took her in without hesitation. Her name was Sarah, and she'd run from a mining camp where her husband had sold her to cover his gambling debts. She stayed 2 weeks while Eleanor taught her the basics of frontier survival, and Ethan helped arrange passage to a town where she had family. More came after that. Not many, one every few months, but enough that Eleanor started keeping supplies specifically for them. Spare clothes, food, a little money scraped together from the small amounts Ethan made selling furs and excess garden produce. They turned the guest room into a proper shelter, with clean blankets and a lock on the inside of the door so women could feel safe while they slept. Ethan watched Eleanor work with these women, saw the fire in her eyes when she helped them plan their escapes, saw the satisfaction when they rode off toward new lives. She'd found her purpose, the thing that made her survival mean something beyond just staying alive. And he'd found his purpose too, protecting the space where that work could happen, making sure the valley stayed safe, stayed hidden, stayed a sanctuary for people who needed one. One evening in late September, as the aspens were starting to turn gold and the first hints of autumn chill touched the air, Eleanor found him on the porch, watching the sunset. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him. "Just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago." "Better different or worse different?" "Better. Definitely better." He took her hand. "Year ago, I was alone and wanted to stay that way. Thought I didn't deserve anything else. And now? Now I'm thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I do deserve this, deserve you, deserve to be happy again." Eleanor smiled. "Took you long enough to figure that out. I'm a slow learner." "You're stubborn. There's a difference." He laughed, and she laughed with him. And somewhere in that moment, Ethan realized he'd stopped just surviving and started actually living again. The ghosts were still there. Sarah and Emma would always be part of him, but they weren't the only thing anymore. There was room now for new memories, new purpose, new love. "Marry me," he said, the words surprising him as much as her. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Marry me. Make this official. Build a real life together instead of just surviving together." "Ethan, I can't legally marry. I'm still technically married according to Pennsylvania law. My husband only died 3 years ago, and I don't care about Pennsylvania law. I care about you and me and what we want to build here." He turned to face her fully. "We'll do it frontier style. Stand in front of witnesses, say our vows, live as married. That's as legal as anything else out here." "You're sure? Because I come with complications. Women showing up at random hours, a past that might still chase me, no money, no—" He kissed her, cutting off the list of reasons she thought he should say no. When he pulled back, she was crying again. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "You're impossible. You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." But she was smiling through the tears. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Frontier style or any other way you want." They married in October with Marshal Briggs officiating and half of Silver Creek in attendance. The town had adopted Eleanor's cause as their own, and her wedding became a celebration of freedom as much as love. The women she'd helped came when they could, standing witness to the fact that sometimes survival led to something better than just staying alive. Eleanor wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric the shopkeeper had given her, simple and practical but beautiful in its own way. Ethan wore his only good shirt and pants that didn't have holes, and felt more nervous than he'd been facing down Crowley's hired guns. They said their vows in the same courthouse where Eleanor had claimed her freedom, and when Briggs pronounced them married, the whole room erupted in cheers. It wasn't a fancy Philadelphia society wedding, but it was real, built on choice and respect, and the hard work of two broken people learning to be whole again. The party lasted until well after dark. Then they rode back to the valley together, husband and wife by frontier law and personal choice, if not by Pennsylvania statute. It didn't matter. They'd learned that legal papers didn't make relationships real. Commitment did. Choice did. Showing up every day and choosing to stay. Winter came again, and this time Eleanor didn't flinch at the isolation. She'd learned to love the quiet, learned to see the beauty in snow-covered peaks and frozen creeks. They spent the long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from the small collection of books they'd accumulated, making plans for spring. A letter arrived in early February, carried by a traveling merchant who'd braved the passes before they fully closed. It was addressed to Eleanor Vance, her maiden name, and bore a Philadelphia postmark. Eleanor stared at it for a long time before opening it. Ethan sat beside her, ready to provide whatever support she needed. The letter was from her mother, short, formal, explaining that her father had died the previous autumn, and in settling his estate, the lawyers had discovered that the contract with Crowley had never been properly filed, that it might not have been legal, even in Pennsylvania. "He knew," Eleanor said quietly. "My father knew the contract was questionable, but he sold me anyway. Took Crowley's money and gambled that no one would ever check the legal details. I'm sorry." "Don't be, I'm not." She folded the letter back up. "He's dead. The contract was fraudulent from the start, and I'm free. Really, completely free. No legal questions, no territorial boundaries, just free." She walked to the fire and dropped the letter in. They watched it burn, another piece of the past turning to ash. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked. "Light, like I've been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there, and now it's gone." She turned to him. "I spent so long being angry at my family, at Crowley, at everyone who treated me like I wasn't human. And now I just feel done. Ready to let all of it go and focus on what matters. Which is this, you, the life we're building, the women we're helping." She moved into his arms. "Everything that comes next." Spring returned, bringing new life to the valley. The garden was larger this year, expanded to feed not just 2 people, but whoever might show up needing help. Ethan built a second small cabin on the property, a proper shelter for the women who came through, giving them privacy and safety. Eleanor worked with a determination that amazed him, teaching survival skills and offering hope to women who'd forgotten what hope looked like. She became something of a legend in the whispered networks, the woman who'd stood up to Victor Crowley and won, who'd built a sanctuary in the wilderness for those who needed it. Crowley himself became a cautionary tale. Word filtered back that his reputation had never recovered from the public humiliation in Silver Creek. His business dealings suffered when people started questioning his character. The last anyone heard, he'd moved to California and disappeared into obscurity, his power broken by one woman's refusal to accept ownership. Years passed. The ranch grew. The valley became known as a safe place, and women came from all over the territory seeking Eleanor's help. Some stayed a few days, some a few months. All of them left stronger than they'd arrived, carrying with them the knowledge that they could fight back, could claim their own lives, could refuse to be owned. Ethan and Eleanor grew older together, their partnership deepening into something neither of them had thought possible after their respective tragedies. The ghosts never fully left. Sarah and Emma, the husband Eleanor had lost, the lives they'd lived before finding each other. But the ghosts became part of the story instead of the whole story. On warm summer evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, hands clasped, comfortable in the silence they'd built together. Sometimes they'd talk about the past, but mostly they talked about the future, about plans and possibilities and the women whose lives they'd helped change. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one evening. "Taking me in that day? Everything that came after?" Ethan thought about it, the confrontation with Crowley, the fear and uncertainty, the way his quiet life had been upended. Then he looked at the woman beside him, strong and fierce and free, and shook his head. "Not for a second. You brought me back to life when I thought I was done living." "We brought each other back," Eleanor corrected. "Neither of us could have done it alone." "No, we couldn't have." They sat in the gathering darkness, 2 people who'd found each other in the ashes of their old lives and built something new from the rubble. It wasn't the life either of them had planned or expected, but it was real. Earned through survival and choice and the simple decision to keep showing up day after day for each other and for the people who needed help. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving, still a place where the wrong decision could cost you everything. But it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, could shed the chains of their past and choose new futures. Eleanor had chosen freedom. Ethan had chosen to live again. Together, they'd chosen to build something that mattered, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after. And in the end, that choice made all the difference. The story of the woman who refused to be owned and the man who helped her claim her freedom became the kind of tale people told around campfires and in saloons across the territory. Details changed with each telling. Eleanor became taller, more beautiful, more defiant. Crowley became richer, more cruel, more powerful. The confrontation in Silver Creek grew from a court hearing to a near riot that almost burned the town down. But the heart of the story stayed the same, that sometimes, when you stand up and refuse to accept injustice, the world shifts just enough to let you through. That freedom isn't given, it's taken. That survival is just the beginning, and real life starts when you choose to build something beyond just staying alive. And in a small valley in the Colorado mountains, that truth lived on in the quiet work of two people who'd learned it the hard way and dedicated the rest of their lives to helping others learn it too. Years later, when age had silvered Eleanor's hair and carved deep lines in Ethan's face, they still sat on that porch watching sunsets, still held hands in the quiet evenings, still welcomed women who came seeking the sanctuary they'd built. And sometimes, when the light hit just right and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers from the meadow, Eleanor would lean against Ethan's shoulder and whisper the same words she'd said that first night after the contract burned. "Thank you for believing I was worth fighting for." And Ethan would always answer the same way. "You were never not worth fighting for. You just needed someone to remind you." They'd both learned that love, real love, wasn't about rescue or ownership or one person saving another. It was about two people choosing each other, day after day, in the small moments and the large ones. About building something together that neither could have built alone. About refusing to give up on themselves or each other, even when the world said they should. And in the end, that choice, to fight, to stay, to build, to love, was the only freedom that really mattered.